On behalf of, obviously, all of us here at the Wagner School and the Rudin Center for Transportation Policy, I want to welcome all of you here, and particularly our speaker for the evening, who flew across the little pond to be with us, Professor Harry Dimitriou. You know, as Hillary mentioned, this is a very bold step for a university, to particularly one already in a globalized city, to create an enterprise like this, an enormous challenge, an integrated intellectual enterprise across huge distances of space and time and language and culture. And so it requires a lot of interesting and new thinking about how to do something that some of us in the infrastructure business do a lot, which is think about how to build bridges. This time, though, we're going to talk about building bridges between Washington Square and the Corniche in Abu Dhabi, between the intellectual communities that are here and the great minds that are there, between a great middle-aged city, I say that advisedly, a great middle-aged city, it's all relative, and one of the great burgeoning cities and urban areas of the Middle East. So today is a great step in building that. My partner in this effort, as you met, is Hilary Ballin, who has been my thought partner on this whole thing from the beginning, and our theory was to ask some of the leading scholars of the world to think about issues that are common to both of these cities, even though they appear at first glance not to have all that much in common. But there are more things than you think. They're both great port cities and in port regions, and so issues of global trade are facing both of them. And so in a couple of weeks, we'll be having a conversation with a scholar who thinks about issues of logistics and global trade and how it affects New York and the United Arab Emirates and Abu Dhabi. They're both cities on the water, which means issues of global warming and the rising sea levels are going to affect both of these cities, and they both need to be doing some pretty hard thinking about it. And tonight, we're honored to be joined by one of the leading experts in the world to consider another big issue both of these cities have in common, which is how to devise and implement the great public projects that will shape these cities for generations to come. Those enormous mega projects that have proved time and time again to be extraordinarily difficult to deliver on time, on budget, or frankly, in some cases, deliver at all. I think there's quite a few of you in the room, actually, of some personal familiarity with the challenges of trying to do these in New York. Those challenges are worthy of consideration. Professor Harry Dimitriou not only studies these issues himself, but he's actually the leader of one of the world's largest efforts to understand megaprojects, an international program funded by the Volvo Foundation and operating in dozens of locations around the world, including right here in New York, where our project team is led by Professor Brescher, one of my colleagues here at Wagner. He brings an extraordinary background to this question. He is the Bartlett Professor of Planning Studies at the University College London, probably the closest school in many ways to New York University that there could be. It was founded 5 years before NYU. It has incredibly important alums, ranging from Mahatma Gandhi and Alexander Graham Bell to all four members of Coldplay and Ricky Gervais. So it's obviously trained important global thinkers. It was actually voted, like I'm sure NYU would be, as the hippest school in the United Kingdom by Vogue magazine. So Harry is, I'm sure, going to be the embodiment of that, as we all are here at NYU, and is generally considered one of the top 10 academic institutions in the world. So we're very proud to have him here. Harry has worked in British local government, done consultancies in Europe and Africa, Asia, the Middle East. His principal areas of research, which we'll hear about, have been about the interaction between urban land use and transportation, urban transportation policy, sustainable development, mega projects, and strategic urban and regional planning, all issues of concern, I suspect, to a lot of us in this room, certainly to those of us here at the Rudin Center. He's held numerous advisory consultancy positions for the European Commission, the World Bank, UNDP, OECD, etc., and on and on. He's consulted for everyone from Hong Kong and Indonesia to parts closer than that, including his own countries, Southeast Asia England Development Agency, Southeast England Development Agency, and the London Development Agency. In 2005, he was awarded the funding for the Volvo Research and Education Foundation's project, a multi-year study to understand the complexity, uncertainty, and risk-taking associated in planning across a wide range of sectors when it comes to mega projects. Tonight, we hope he'll share some of his preliminary thinking on a project that still has much work to do, and perhaps a case he's begun to look at. He's the author of a number of books, all on transportation planning, urban development, land use planning, and he's currently at work on a book on motorization and sustainable development in Asia. In short, I don't think Hillary and I could probably have a better opening speaker for this series. Someone who actually does think about things like building bridges is here to help us build a bridge of our own. Tonight, NYU adds one more connection between two great cities, confronting the common challenges of two very uncommon places. So please join me in welcoming Professor Harry Dimitriou of the University College London.
Thank you very much, Tony. My gosh, I can't live up to that. Someone else you were talking about, I think. Thank you very much for this invitation. I want to make one thing very, very clear. Someone from England doesn't come to the center of the big projects to tell you how to build big projects. I'm not here to give you, if you like, advice about how to build big projects. What I'm here to do is actually to share with you what I believe and my colleagues believe is a global need to re-examine big projects in a different way. So this is one of the world's capitals of big projects. So I'm not here to sort of indicate how best to do it, but what can we learn from our previous experiences? Now, let me get this machine going. I'm going to, if I may, skip quite a few slides. This is usually done with a colleague who's the techie, and he does the tech bit, and I do the policy and the lessons bit. So I'm going to skip the techie bit. I know enough about it to tell you what it's all about, but I think we're interested in the lessons and policy implications of what we're doing and policy questions. And assuming I've got that right, you won't mind if I do the skipping. Very, very briefly, I'm going to take you through the main aims and research questions of the Omega Research Program. I'm going to present to you an outline of the study methodology which we believe is innovative. It hasn't been without its problems, as Chuck will tell you over a cup of coffee, but it is very much relying, apart from normal methodologies of data collection analysis, on storytelling and narratives of decision makers who've actually done the projects. I'll be telling you a little bit about that methodology, but what is significant is that the findings that I will be presenting to you are actually from a computerized software analysis of the stories. It's not from a literature review. It's not from our observations. These are extracts, conclusions arrived at a constellation, if you like, a clustering of stories that my techie friends have worked out. And we are going to be cross-examining those stories, the narratives, with our more traditional hypothesis-led research questions, which I won't be going in detail about on this occasion, but I will in the next talk in Abu Dhabi. I'll conclude on the issue of context, the importance of context. It's funny, isn't it, how the most important things we pretend we always deal with, but actually we don't. What's generic knowledge? What is the knowledge that we can take from New York to Abu Dhabi to London to Moscow? But what is the knowledge that actually needs to be molded, needs to be sensitive to context? And there are inherent problems in addressing this, particularly economic and commercial problems for companies that take their expertise from one part of the world to the other, because there is a tendency, a desire to template solutions, because that makes the economics of delivering these projects quicker, but also it gives confidence, because if you've done it before, then you can do it again, successfully, presumably. So this whole issue of what's relevant for us in England, what's relevant for the Dutch, the French, Japanese, the Greeks, the Australians. This is part of the research program. We are all coming together at the end of this year, beginning of next year, with our findings of our case studies, and if you like, beginning to see if the jigsaw fits, or what parts of the jigsaw fits, what parts are common, and what parts are not. And I'm going to give you, if I may, at the end, some of the observations that we've come out from our narrative analysis. And you can, I've ringed those that I think are generic, but I'm in a very preliminary mode at the moment. And you can think, particularly those of you who've been involved in the field, you can think, yes, I can relate to that. That doesn't have to be about the Channel Tunnel Rail Link. It could be about many, many other projects. So, very simple question. What constitutes a successful mega-urban transport project? I'm not going to define everything, every step as I go along. It'll take me too long. Simple question, difficult answer. Because the truth of the matter is, the agenda of how we judge success has changed. In the 21st century, we have the agenda of sustainable development and its component aims. Many of these projects that we're looking at best, had a little bit of rhetoric about the field of sustainable development. Not worse, but the reality was it wasn't around at the time, or it didn't have the political clout. Secondly, how well has risk, uncertainty, and complexity, because these projects are complex, they are often launched in complex circumstances, how well has the risk and uncertainty and the complexity been treated? You could argue that actually how well these elements are treated is a sign of success, but I'm not necessarily going to take you down that path. That could be your conclusion. And then you have this issue of context. What is successful today may be a disaster tomorrow, or what's a disastrous project today could be a success 30 years down the line. And we could actually look historically to many projects of that kind. So I think you're getting the gist of this narrative. It's a very complex area, and somehow we're treating it like a science, an engineering science, in some cases a policy science. Now, one of the things that's fundamental, at this rate I'm not going to get too far with my lecture. Anyway, we'll go as far as we can with the time. One of the things that's fundamental is how we define the project, because the project can be a line haul. It can be a railway line from A to B, or it can be the station with the railway line, or it can be the real estate that's around the station along the railway line, or it can actually be the whole sub-region, as indeed is the Channel Tunnel Rail Link. So you can judge the project by the trains and how fast they go, if they work or whatever, but you could also judge the project by the extent to which they've stimulated, regenerated, had an impact on the areas they traverse, and indeed the societies they traverse. So defining what you mean by the project, a very simple, obvious statement, is actually one of the biggest errors. When judgments are made about the failures of projects, if you talk with the other parties, they're actually looking at a different project. They're looking at it at a smaller perspective or a broader one. So it's very clear, it's very important to be clear. Secondly, of course, an obvious statement, but from which perspective, which stakeholder perspective are we looking at this? Are we looking at this from the private sector that's funding it and basically treating it as a business, or the community, or the public sector? And of course, we're back to that same old question. If we've done these projects before, how do we know when we do them elsewhere that they're sensitive enough to where we're doing it. I mean, why are we presuming that as far as we can, templating is a good thing? I learnt in interviews, I won't mention the company, but if I had told you, you wouldn't be surprised, that essentially the knowledge about these projects are kept in-house. I couldn't understand why it was the literature and the research in this field, and these projects are billion-dollar projects. Why is it there is so little information in the public domain of a systematic examination? I mean, there's been the odd books, and Alan Altshuler's book, and Bernard Fubio, but if you really look at the expenditure on these projects, you have this tin pot outfit. I mean, you made us sound very grandiose, but we're pretty small, really. We've got 30 projects on the website for the first time. There's all these projects, compare, contrast basis. Why is that? And it's actually because knowledge of this kind is a commodity. And Volvo, even though it's has commercial roots, it's a foundation, the Volvo Foundation, the aim is to actually put this knowledge in the public domain so that we, as a public, can choose what to learn and what to abandon. Now, the traditional criteria of success is to finish on time, within budget, get the travel time savings from the transport projects you've got, get the rates of return. But just think, you can have the project finished on time, within budget, but it's the wrong project, the wrong place, doing the wrong thing, environmentally a disaster. Or you can have a project that actually, in retrospect, in hindsight, has been adaptable and proven to be much more flexible than one thought when one paid the excessive amount for it in the first place. The next thing is, well, we all know the rhetoric about sustainable development, but what we don't really know is what elements of it we should be paying heed to. Obviously, climate change is a very significant part, but there's the energy. There's so many dimensions. It's multi-sectorial in composition. We've included the concept, as you will see in a moment, of institutional sustainability. There's no point having sustainable visions and sustainable economic programs if you don't have the institutions around to see them through. And incidentally, we in England are pretty good at setting up new institutions all the time and then abandoning them. And so you've actually got this fragmentation, littered institutions that never really got into the field, and so they can't be the guardians of the vision. Now, if you speak to any military person, they will tell you immediately that when you have complexity, when you have big risks, when you have uncertainty, the only way forward is strategic thinking. And strategic thinking, I can't speak for you here. You have a heritage of your own in terms of corporate management and strategic thought. But in Britain, strategic thinking has been dead. Well, it's almost dead for the last 20, 25 years since Mrs. Thatcher wielded her axes. But you cannot deal with complexity, you cannot deal with risk, and you can't do uncertainty without a strategy, and that's the whole idea. And so we have learnt quite a lot from those sciences, medicine, agriculture, military, about the use of strategic thinking. And what we've tried to do is to bring these dimensions into the project. Okay. The starting point, I hope I don't offend anyone here in the room, but the starting point is that the current appraisal methodologies for big projects are not fit for purpose. They're not fit for purpose for the 21st century. They are products of the 20th century, and at best were overstretched beyond their capabilities. Now, if that's really, really true, and I believe it is, and we're going out to illustrate that through case studies, then our educational programs are meanwhile teaching the same professional templated knowledge And the realities are very different. And all we have to do, for example, and we have this in our own research program, a problem since we started, we should be looking at all our big projects in terms of how they should be retrofitted for climate change flood potential. The CTRL, the Channel Tunnel Rail, in which I'm using as our first case study, is actually going to be flooded in the next 25, 30 years. It's in a floodplain. So one thing is to deliver these projects on time, as we said, on budget. But actually the agenda has moved. As we learn more about climate change, environmental issues. So clearly when you make a judgment about success, you start off with the objectives of the project. It's the only thing you can start off with. I mean, it's unethical to do anything else. If a project has a set of objectives, it may be the wrong ones, but you can make a judgment about how it's delivered on those original ones. But if, as you are, I'm sure, fully aware, many of these projects take 35 years from conception to implementation. And over the 35 years, the objectives change. They become organic. Understandably, they adapt to the context of time, culture, politics, economy, booms and busts. So judging a project against its objectives is only a limited exercise. It really needs to look at adapted objectives that change over time. So this means that you cannot, if you like, take an engineering view about it. One actually has to take a policy view, as indeed policy responses similarly have to be organically responsive to the context in which they emerge. Secondly, we have within our group, our 10 partners, some significant disagreements. Some of it is culturally based, some of it not. Some of it's ideologically based as to what exactly the sustainable development visions are that we should have these projects address. Now, this is a very tricky one. Now, the truth of the matter is we do need to appraise our big projects against the new agenda, whatever the priorities may be. But the question is, to what extent is that agenda not only driven by global priorities, but actually very much by local priorities? And of course, one way of tackling this is to just treat it as rhetoric and really not get down to the realities. Do the project as we did it the last year, the last decade. Incidentally, one of the big characteristics of big projects is never use new technology. And of course, what that does is put you into path dependency of old technology, because you're supposed to take the least risks in big projects. Now that's a contradiction, because by definition, a big project is a big risk, but the idea is you contain it. Then we come on to the whole issue of, well, okay, how well in the decision-making and in the implementation has risk, uncertainty, and complexity been treated? The research we did prior to the main program was work done in association with other disciplines, from medicine, military, insurance companies, banking, of how they treated risk and uncertainty. And in all of the cases, the importance of context came out. It's an obvious conclusion, is that a risk is going to be conditioned by the context. Some contexts raise the risk. And I don't mean cultural, geographical context. We are now in a recession, and how exactly do we deal with the risk? How do we view it? Do you take the Chinese perspective and see a crisis as an opportunity? And do you go for the big gamble and make the project deliver, as they did in Hong Kong in 1997? They delivered all these big projects to reduce the uncertainty that they were facing up until 1997. Big risk, big gamble? Or do you actually cut back, trim back? What we're hoping to do in consultation with our partners and seeing from the patterns of knowledge, because this is essentially what we're trying to do, is to identify patterns of knowledge and to see where they reinforce and where they don't each other, is to come up with some new guidelines and lessons and try and ascertain what of these lessons are generic and what are not. The diagram that we have up here is essentially the framework of our analysis that we submitted in our successful proposal. And you will you will see that as an input is our literature review and our research specialist inputs from different professions about the treatment of risk, uncertainty, and complexity. We used the early project as a methodology of gleaning from these other professions how they dealt with that group of dimensions. The definition of mega urban transport projects themselves, I've already alluded to. The concepts that were employed in planning and delivering them, the issues they confronted, the impacts they had, and the techniques a compare and contrast examination was the original idea. Now, the extent to which any of you have done international comparative studies with large numbers of partners before, you have to be an optimist or an idiot, and probably I'm both. But you will get only some of these things out, because the truth of the matter is that everyone is looking at different parts of the same jigsaw. But the idea is that we compare. For example, cost-benefit analysis is a technique used, I suspect, in all of them. But if you examine and the responses we are getting on the use of them, is that it's a methodology that's been used beyond its capabilities in big projects. And so what we have is an admission that we have tools that are not fit for purpose. It's very straightforward to have the projects try and deliver the objectives that were set from the outset, good or bad. It's a very, very different thing to actually re-examine them in the light of the Sustainable Development Agenda. It's an agenda that is evolving. It's an agenda that is gathering knowledge and abandoning knowledge as we go along. And it's a very stark reality to the techno-rationalist that actually we are not entirely sure what our policy framework is. We're not as sure as our engineering models suggested, or even our economic models pretended to offer us, let alone the financial models that proved really what they were. And so we're coming to this concept of complexity. We're talking about complex visions, whether we're talking about New York, Abu Dhabi, or London, the concept of sustainability, the threats, the opportunities of them. Now, here we've introduced 4 dimensions, crude dimensions. The economic sustainability dimension, well known now. Environmental, one, the origins of the sustainability debate. There are some, incidentally, who believe if you move beyond environment, you're betraying the concept of sustainability. So there are a few Taliban environmentalists around, but you have to look at this in a multidisciplinary way. The social, the idea that you have communities which have sustained livelihoods. There's a lot of rhetoric in England about that. Every community is sustainable, but actually, if you look very carefully, they ain't very sustainable at all. So, but the concept that communities need to sustain themselves and move forward with visions, and I've already mentioned the institutional. Now, all these big projects over time are going to be confronting challenges. It could be the globalization of capital. It may be, for example, that a lot of these projects are increasingly relying on private capital and have actually staked their future on foreign capital, only to find that the banks have run out of money, or to find out that the sovereign wealth funds have made a nice deal to actually take over your infrastructure, but that you don't know who the owners are of these companies. So you can actually have Al-Qaeda owning a major piece of strategic infrastructure in Britain or in America, because sovereign wealth funds don't declare themselves who they have no shareholders. So the issue of transparency, that's a challenge. Of course, you have the other one I've mentioned before, the challenge of flooding. You have the challenge of there's quite a few, the health and safety. There's a whole raft. What is most significant that I can say that's come from our work so far, and I'd be interested to hear what Charles and my colleagues have to say, is that actually the institutional sustainability is the glue. It's not only the glue, it's the lubricant of the sustainability vision. It glues together the concept. Without institutions to keep it together, and without the lubricants of ideas to make it operational, the concept of sustainability is at best an academic one, and you wouldn't want that. I'm probably going to get through 5 of these slides. I hope you don't mind. But you can see the you can have the slideshow later on. But essentially, I have always been skeptical of 2 things. First of all, academics writing for themselves, and secondly, professionals writing for themselves. It's all very cozy because each peer group sort of nods and winks to each other, and that's fine. But when you have the interface, well, what we're trying to do here is to admit, and we worked with some guys from IBM, ex-IBM management consultants, who placed a lot of credit in their eyes, and they've been using actually for your home security as well here in the States, a lot of work on narrative analysis to try and extract knowledge. There's no doubt about it that we are, as human beings, storytellers. That's what we do, whether it's good stories or not. And within the storytelling is knowledge. And within these stories, it is foolish, is it not, to actually compile them, analyze them, and see how it fits against more normative thinking. Because, as one of my colleagues pointed out to us in doing our research, it's all well and good us interviewing these guys who've been doing all these projects, but they may have been doing the wrong thing all this time. You need to have an assessment, a normative assessment, values against which to judge their practice. On the other hand, the practitioners can say, well, Harry, you've not really managed a big project before, so why are you presenting these normative values and judging my practice? And this, of course, beckons the whole idea of interface, communication, and sharing knowledge. And to my surprise, and sometimes I'm sure we all in this situation feel very, very naive, when I was told by the largest contracting firm in the world, so you can guess who it is, that they actually keep their knowledge in-house about these projects, you begin to realize that this is an unhealthy situation. The bankers have been doing it for too long. The bankers, even as you know, Standard & Poor's, had their own appraisers from the banks to appraise themselves. Right. So this is... Right. Enough of that. Very quickly, what we pursued was a very straightforward public domain literature review of whatever there is about the projects. The kind of thing PhD students would do. But we would put them up on the website so we can see, compare and contrast the projects we're doing. Secondly, we joined hands with these consultants who claim to be knowledge management consultants, and they showed us the art of the pre-hypothesis investigations, where you actually allowed the interviewee to set the agenda, to say what they had to say, as so long as it was about the project. So whatever came out, came out. And then we had the agenda and the questions that were designed from the outset. What were the objectives? How was risk and uncertainty treated? And we collected these. It's most important, incidentally, if you're interviewing the same people, to have the pre-hypothesis, the non-directed interviews, before you have the hypothesis. The whole idea is to just let the parties talk. And incidentally, they do talk. We've interviewed ex-prime ministers, and it's interesting how people like to talk about projects once they've retired in particular, but not only that. And the idea is that we collect this information, some of it analyzed with the assistance of software, which we have been having problems with. Don't let me give the idea that everything's honky-dory. And the idea is you have unstructured interviews, you have hypothesis interviews, and you have structured knowledge and unstructured knowledge, and you put them together to see actually what comes out. No agenda. It's what we call sense-making. We call this sense-making. I mean, I have views about certain things, but we are trying to find out through this methodology. Okay, that's just the countries we're working in. It's 10 countries in all, and I won't go through. There's a slideshow outside the projects that we're doing. The three in the UK we're looking at is the Jubilee Line extension, which is a metro in London. The Channel Tunnel rail link, which those of you know the UK is the first railway we've built for 100 years. So we're experts now. We don't go to France to look. We don't know how to do it. And the other is an M6 motorway, which is a privatized project. And so we're having an insight into... Now, I've already mentioned the traditional approach and what we like to think is novel, innovative approach, and matching them together. The framework of matching them together is probably the most difficult. Now, I've actually explained ahead of the slides, really. The pre-hypothesis interviews are those which are not by definition led by any hypotheses. They're trying to get feelings about these parties, about what, and some of it's emotional, about when was it sabotaged, when did the project really do well. You're trying to get extreme reactions, and then you plot that once you've got the other 20, 15 interviews, and you see if there's any pattern coming out. Sorry. I've already mentioned the fact that narratives are contextually very rich, and so the whole issue of context matters. One comment, I spent 10 years in Hong Kong, and one of the interviews we had 3 days ago was saying, well, these guys from Hong Kong came here, they took over the Jubilee line because it was in a mess, and they thought because they're from Hong Kong they could do things, but they forgot that actually Britain is a democracy and Hong Kong wasn't. And that's context. So, and it's true. The truth of the matter is that you presume, because you did it in Hong Kong, you can do it in London, but that's not the case. Of course, it can be the case if it's made to be the case, but all things being equal, it's not the case. I won't go into the details of how many we did. That's the kind of question, prompting question. I'll just give you one or two. I mentioned it before, actually. One of the question two is, tell me about the time when this project was rescued or sabotaged. And it's quite incredible how you suddenly find emotions coming out. The guys probably wouldn't be saying that for a long time. When have you or your members of your community suffered or been inspired as a result of the project? You're looking for two extremes and plotting these responses. Of course, each of these responses have a relationship to their status, their job, and their own context, and so that one needs to see and know what they did. Now, I'm not going to go through the software bit, except to say that we collect all the transcripts. The software is intended to pick up common stories, common themes. You support it with newspaper articles, films, any supporting evidence that makes a difference to the story, and then you begin to identify patterns with issues that come up. And it's on that basis, as I say, I'm not going to go through all the details. My techie colleague's not here with me to tell you how it's done. But what's interesting is that the lessons I'm going to talk to you, or the observations, are actually from this methodology. It's not from a literature review, it's not from... and we will be examining the literature review responses later. And it's very time-consuming, and in that regard, it is a problem. But you actually get bundles of stories that fit. One thing, however, it has to be understood, and those of you who've been involved in big projects will know this, is you can have 100 different stories on the same project, and no one is lying. The fact of it is that there's a different angle on the same thing. Right. These are our preliminary findings on the Channel Tunnel rail link. It's a fast train rail link linking the Channel Tunnel to London. First railway that we've built in 100 years, and now the talk is of building other fast trains throughout England at last. But let's see what, if any, of these observations that you might recognize without ever having met me before and without knowing this project. And I wonder, my colleagues in the other 30 projects, 10 countries, how many of them will come up with similar conclusions? Similar patterns, I'm sorry. Politics and the role of champions. I mean, one of the issues that came out is the role of champions for projects. The big projects need a political champion very often, and they need a political guardian very often. Not the same thing. I understand that it was kind of a miracle that the Big Dig, for so long, seemed to benefit, but you know more about this than I do. I'm going to be having lunch with Fred Savuzzi on day after tomorrow, so I'll be hearing his side of the story, and with Alan Altshuler too. But the Shuto Expressway, right, the champion, the guardian. I'm only going to go through the ones I'm highlighting in red, because they're the ones we thought might be of generic value. The JFK air train, is that correct, Charles? There was a visionary champion there?
That's right. Visionary modifier.
Okay. All right. The other observation, obvious though it may be, is that there are over time many, many different forces that shape projects, particularly since projects are very long ones. And different players have different roles, and projects change over time. So actually, projects become organic. They're not engineering phenomena, they're actually organic phenomena. If you like, the closest analogy you can have, those of you who had knee replacement jobs, or will have, will know, is that it's like having a piece of metal put in your body, and then if the tissue takes to it, you have no inflammation, then the project's a success. If, on the other hand, it creates a lot of discomfort and medical implications, then the project doesn't fit. The truth of the matter is these projects are adapt to the environment, the societies, the communities, and indeed the politicians and budgets that they have. So they will never be the same animal from the day they started to the one they actually completed. The CTRL was a project to promote regional restructuring. It actually, even though Margaret Thatcher declared it a financial private sector project, I think it was bankrupt twice, the real agenda was actually subsequently that of restructuring the territory it went through. But there was a great deal of pretense all along that this was a straightforward project that was going to pay its way and was going to keep within budget, and it was nothing else but that. As time went on, the real estate spoils became part of the deal, sweeteners were, and it's become much more than what it was. What it isn't is a financially viable private sector project. What came out very, very strongly from the feedback we had was that of forming strategic relationships, long-term relationships. Big projects require, and this goes back to the issue of institutional sustainability. Big projects require strategic relationships that sustain themselves over time. And it can be, incidentally, at different levels. The leadership can change. It can be, this strategic relationship can be pivotal at one phase of the project, at central government, and it can be in the private sector the next, or it can be at local government. But what it is there's a strategic element that keeps the project alive and operational. Remember, these are the patterns that came out from the stories. Well, no surprise, the conflicts between short and long-term strategies was for always and forever prevalent. Developers who were linked to the railway project from the spoils that they were going to get from the real estate always downplayed the risks. And other stakeholders seem to have a short-term smash and grab attitude. One of the features, of course, which is very interesting, is how some companies go bust on the project and re-emerge in another form later on. So they actually haven't gone bust, but they have. Of course, the whole issue as to whether big projects always have the first guys who go bust and have the others who pick up the cream, I always find that difficult to understand. If there is a track record of that happening, why is it everyone's so keen to go in on the first? But there is that pattern. There is no doubt about it that early planning is critical. All the parties indicated that planning ahead, it's not the engineering, it's the planning ahead that made a great deal of difference. Or putting it another way, the absence of planning creates headaches later on. Once again, projects were often the victim of the length of time it took for them to be built. They, if you like, they got a bad reputation. What's emerged, however, and there's no one story on this, there's a very big divide. There is a very strong school, and remember that these are practitioners who actually argue that big projects need time to breathe. That actually, the time that these projects take, whether it's 35 years, is not to be something to be deemed a failure. Is that the adaptation, it's like the knee, going back to the replacement knee, it needs time for it to take on its form and to integrate itself with the body. So that's one school of thought, is that you need to give projects time to breathe. And if you have, as we have, we're just setting up in England, an infrastructure commission to speed up planning decisions, one needs to be very careful not to speed up the wrong project. On the other hand, all of the parties, those included who argue that, claim that there is a point at which this time to breathe needs to stop. You don't stop breathing, of course, but you actually need to freeze the project in terms of its accepted dynamic changes and implement it, because if you don't, it's just going to go on and on and on. So there is this time to breathe argument, but when do you lock into the project and get it done? And the other issue, which isn't from the interviews, but from our thoughts about the interview responses, is what is the most appropriate time to then restart the project and accept it as an open system? If you recollect, I started off the talk by emphasizing how important it was to define the project correctly. Project managers, contractors, look at these projects as closed systems. They have to a degree. Budgets, engineering, responsibilities. But the truth of the matter is these big projects are part of an open system. They interact with other transport networks, with communities, so they are not closed systems. And the expertise we have, and I can only speak for Britain, it's probably different here, the expertise we have for big projects are all project managers. They're all experts in closed systems. And that's part of the problem. And the other part of the problem is that all sitting regional planners are so in awe of the engineers and the project managers, because they build big projects, that they feel somewhat nervous to tell these guys what to do, because everything's open all the time, and they don't get down to very often getting projects delivered. So there is this friction. Most key decisions are shaped by the project at the highest political level. We interviewed John Prescott, who was the Deputy Prime Minister, and Michael Heseltine, and it was rather refreshing, if you like, for an academic. Here we are trying to get an intellectual academic rationale for why they went ahead with the CTRL at a particular point in time, and he said it was very easy. I told them to get on with it. There was no attempt to rationalize it beyond a decision had been made, the politicians made, it needed to be done. The amount of political maneuvering and consensus building that takes place is quite incredible, and that's a lot of investment of time, and this is where trust, the issue of trust, becomes a major dimension. When it comes to consultation about projects, the feedback we're having on this particular project is that really the private sector are not so keen on engaging. although there are attitudes are changing, but there is definitely a polite reluctance. One of the realities of delivering these projects and problems is the high staff turnover. Once one big project is nearing an end, he will be hijacked for another one. And what there is not, and we hope to help do something to rectify that, what there is not, there's a shortage of this expertise in the country, and indeed in the world. And this small band, okay, I'll tell you the name, Bechtel, right? They go around the world and they actually do these projects, and it's a small band that go and do this project here, that project there, that project there. But the actual countries involved don't have a very big capacity to deliver these projects. So if you have a bunch of them come together for whatever reason, there is an issue of capacity to do and deliver. Because they are very complicated. And let's be very honest, some of them are quite incredible. The Orson Link, those of you who've been to Denmark or Sweden, I mean, some of these projects are marvels when you think of what's being achieved. I mean, in engineering term and in every respect. Now, sharing knowledge, sharing information ain't good. It's kind of closed. The railway line, the Channel Tunnel Rail Link, through the initiatives of privatization, has Eurostar, which went bankrupt twice, and is still operational. And the regional authority, the South East England Regional Authority, wanted to get some insight into passenger use, so it wanted to collect passenger details on the platforms. Eurostar prevented them from collecting that information because it said it was commercially sensitive information. So here we have, as a company that's been bankrupted twice, bailed out by the French and English government, acting like a private company, not allowing the public sector to gather information about the very investment that it's paid. So the whole issue of transparency and sharing information is a very, very critical one. It's critical because if we do have these projects to deliver, we actually need to learn from our mistakes as well as from our successes. Another dimension which came out is the need to understand the project holistically. It goes back to the issue, and to a certain degree this is understandable because one has to focus to deliver. But having said that, it's becoming apparent, and we have now been approached by Crossrail, which is one of the biggest projects being planned at the moment in the UK, to actually encourage capacity buildings for cross-disciplinary knowledge sharing. Not a surprise, personalities, personal relationships, make or break projects, make or break people. With regard to the CTRL, why don't you check out some of these stories for the projects that you know. British Railways, which was the original, if you like, sponsor of this project, never considered it financially viable. But if it was never considered financially viable, why did they build it if government was saying that everything had to be financially viable? So where is this rhetoric coming from? Where is this pretense? Why are we hearing one thing and other things are being done? Is it that really the public don't understand that politicians need to make big decisions? And that, well, we've had the banking crisis recently, and we had decisions made for us I don't know about you guys, but we're pretty short of money. We just bailed out the banks in the UK. And that was a decision made for us. But it may well be that it's been felt that the public will not support the project, and so you keep this from them. Or we have this saying in England, the dead hand of the Treasury. The Treasury, of course, was Mr. Brown's empire, probably still is, or was until recently, but the Treasury would actually just kill projects by starving because they actually have a much greater risk-averse approach. The other issue, of course, is that some projects, once they gain a momentum, you can't kill them. They actually have a life of their own, and it's a matter of if you like, managing that life. In terms of environmental sustainability, there was quite a lot of evidence. There were rushed decisions on key issues that really showed no consideration for environmental sustainability. And we've taken to reading books on rhetoric because we believe it's central, and I'm not joking now, it's central to understanding big projects and messages by politicians to actually understand why things are said and not meant. Social impacts issues have not been really significant. Real estate, urban regeneration, but there has been no real attempt to measure whether the social rewards have been distributed. One of the dimensions, of course, which you will all recognize, those of you involved, is the desire for certainty. The risks are so high that anything that increases risks is deemed to be problematic. Now, let me conclude, because my time is almost up, I understand. I was given 45 minutes or thereabouts. Let me conclude by returning to this issue of context, because I think this is fundamentally very, very important. If we have got expertise that we take elsewhere, if we have expertise we bring here from elsewhere, it only makes sense to do a context analysis of what that knowledge is as against what we have. But context isn't just about geography and culture, it's about time. What you do in a recession, what do you do in the boom time? It's to do with many things. And we struggled a great deal with this. We had 10 cultures. I don't think we did too well, Chuck, did we really, in dealing with the context issue? But it's there. I mean, you can't wish it away. The fact of the matter is the French build these fast trains, and they have a vision for building fast trains. And we in Britain don't. We've only just discovered, we invented trains, of course, but it's like helicopters. So there is a question, is there a tradition in some places? Is there a culture? Is there a time when things can be done? Is there a way for going about business? Certainly, the risk-averse cultures that we have seen in Britain with big projects has meant that we haven't built big projects for 25 years, really. Very few big projects. We were quite critical of the Germans when they had just absorbed Eastern Germany for their financial state, saying that their economy was bankrupt, and they were building roads linking East and West Germany. It went beyond the financial, fiscal agenda. Now that you could call vision, or that you can call foolishness. It's a call, it's a judgment, it's a political position. Another contextual dimension, most important, is that of the regulatory system. How much there's a lot of analogies here, incidentally, with the banking system. A lot of analogy. Of course, the financing side has impacted directly on big projects. If the public sector does not have a framework to regulate the planning delivery of big projects, then you've actually got a very different culture than where you have. And I understand that Dubai and Abu Dhabi are totally different places as far as regulation takes place. Similarly, in America, you have a tradition in city and regional planning of having more liberal or less regulation on land use, planning and land development than we have had in the UK. The other dimension is trust. I've mentioned this already. Trust is where you have patterns of words being broken, or of bankruptcies, or a company being associated with particular partners. This is also a contextual issue. And of course, the whole issue of what do you do in volatile times? How do you stop all your projects, or do you actually, as I said earlier on, take the crisis as an opportunity and put people into work and build the projects? Some of your best stations, I believe, were built in the Depression. So it sounds, doesn't it, rather obvious that context matters, but we actually don't do a study of the context in which we work sufficiently enough. And understanding context, our own history, our own political system, our own regulations. We need to understand, if we're going to do strategy, I'm not a military person, but doing a reconnaissance is a context sensitivity exercise. And this we need for big projects. You actually need to do that, and on a constant basis. We are living at a time in the 21st century, the first decade, where we have seen incredible things happen. We've seen the American motor car industry decimated. We've seen a global banking system bruised, to say the least. We've seen climate change predictions, which are very, very worrying, and even Mr. Bush takes seriously now, I understand. He's a convert. Well, maybe he's not. Sorry? Consultant. There are a number of toxic global developments that I would argue are, and this is a position really, to my horror, is being looked at by others, of a perfect storm beginning to emerge, where we have an energy crisis, we have a climate change, we have food production problems, we have a number of gathering storms, a financial situation that is the new context for our big projects. Does this mean we don't do big projects? Does this mean that we do projects that are flood-proof? What we are sure about is that the context today, I would argue, is dramatically changing our perspective on what is a success and what is a failure. I'm going to end there. I think I will end it just on a slide that we had in our last workshop, where we grappled with this whole issue of what is context, how important is context, how do we, because we have maybe foolishly promised that we're going to arrive at lessons that are generic, what we believe are generic, and others that are context specific. And we've just thrown in here some of the dimensions: cultural and societal beliefs, values, time and space, economic circumstances, institutional frameworks, political influences. I'll leave it at that, but it is a reality check, is that when you want to answer the question we posed right at the beginning, namely, what is a successful project? It could well be that the context of today makes the particular project we're looking at a complete failure in terms of the new agenda of climate change, or it may have been finished on time, within budget, maybe the most architecturally smart piece of engineering, but it does nothing for the perfect storm scenario that looks quite likely. On the other hand, we have seen projects that were declared failures in the history and are today taken for granted as successes, and everyone's forgotten the cost and everyone's forgotten the pain that was incurred to make them successful in our own term today. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's stating the obvious. Big projects are complex, but actually they're much, much complex than we even thought they were. Thank you.
Thank you for an excellent presentation. The only thing I saw missing in your general list was shared intention. Shared intention.
Yes.
Which you might call vision, you might call context.
Yes. Yes.
And the shared
yeah,
vision by the National Research Council's latest book on critical infrastructure is that projects are passé, they're last century. And really what we should be doing is delivering one of the 4 lifeline systems that we're talking about: water, power, connectivity. Water, power, connectivity. Water, power, connectivity. But anyway, pardon me? Do you think that possibly looking at projects which are spatially and temporally limited possibly is the wrong thing to be looking at? Maybe we should be looking at systems.
They are systems within systems. I mean, I made that point earlier on, is that these big projects actually, if you deem a project to be a closed system, then we've redefined projects. So they are parts of systems. What they are not, though, are parts of transportation systems only. I think, you know, I'm a city planner and a transportation specialist, so-called. Right. But we're not just linking in to other transportation systems. I mean, we don't do that very well anyway. We don't have good integration between rail, air, and whatever. But it's even worse in terms of the integration of the use of our infrastructure to deliver the kind of vision, the kind of future. Now, the whole issue of vision is what differentiates countries and the kinds of visions they have. Your federal highway system was a vision. It wasn't an economic, financial model. I know it was a military piece of hardware too, but it was a vision. And the absence of a vision, all you have to do is to come to England, you see, because essentially you do lots of small things and you do lots of short-term things. And you go to France and you go to Germany and you go to... So there is an issue here, but I'm a little bit hesitant to reply fully to your question, because the truth of the matter is our visions change as we gain new knowledge. To be adamant about a vision in a static manner is a problem. And so I predict that the new area that will become critical for all countries is what I call retrofitting, infrastructure retrofitting. We've got the big projects we've got the infrastructure we've got. The new context is here. How do we retrofit what we've got? And that's an expertise. Retrofitting expertise is different from building new things.
Thanks for the comments. I'm actually working in social media for making civic software, which is sort of like, I'm hearing a lot of the same problems in your space, parallel in mine. But my question is simply about anthropology. There's a whole field that's kind of been lost, and a lot of the questions that you have about context and culture are what anthropology or that discipline is trained to examine in perhaps a far deeper approach than may happen when it happens within other disciplines. Are you employing anthropologists, or how are you engaging with that sort of knowledge area?
Right. Now, we have all kinds of people on our team. In fact, I don't know all the disciplines that we have, but whether we have an anthropologist, I would have to check out. But I don't know whether our situation reflects other situations. I suspect so. We couldn't afford to have every discipline you need. I think that we actually have to go into each other's disciplines. I mean, yes, if we have an anthropologist and that they can also learn a bit about the engineering, then that's how you get the marriage. To actually have an anthropologist or a transportation engineer who only does transport engineering, I think everyone needs to learn each other's knowledge. Now, that's one answer. The other answer is a little bit cynical, if not sad. It has to do with corporate responsibility. That is, let me pose it as a question rather than a conclusion. It's less cynical. Is it the case that our corporate global interests really don't want to hear the anthropological dimensions because it disturbs their templating solutions, reduces profit margins, it is inconvenient, it is this, that? I mean, it seems to me that there's an element of convenience here because we are dealing with a much more, I mean, what we have in the kind of presentation I've got now, there may be some people in the audience, is incredibly frustrating to a guy who's been building projects year after year, decade after decade, and you've got this guy who's never built a project, making his work more complicated. Now, what is the project? Is it the hardware that's delivered and that's what you get and that's what I'm there to do, says the project manager? Or are we actually trying to invest in infrastructure that is sustainable? Well, I don't mean to use this in rhetoric terminology. I mean sustainable, adaptive. It can adapt to different needs. And I would argue that and I didn't know this answer before we started, that one of the criteria for success with big projects is the extent to which they can be adapted to different users. I was in Vietnam last year, and they were opening this huge bridge, and there was all pomp and circumstance and all the music, and the military were there, and flags for this big bridge. And it was only for cars. And someone said to me, well, why can't they just put another level to have for buses and bicycles? Now, that's the quickest retrofit job they could do tomorrow. But I think that that's where the expertise is going to be. That's where we want the expertise to be. But I have to say, maybe it's just my age, I've come into the conclusion that it's no accident that we don't employ anthropologists and sociologists to look at social issues. You know, tell me I'm wrong.
I just wanted to ask, I'm a hyper-rationalist myself, and my question keeps evolving because it's such a fascinating presentation. Really thought-provoking. But there's, you talk about the 35-year life of these projects, and generally, the projects are done to solve a problem or meet a need that exists. And so over that 35-year life, and here's my question, there's human adaptation sort of ends up solving problems. You said before the towns in England are not sustainable, and yet people are living there. So I think that's what you said. So I think what makes a good project, I'm just going to throw out a generalization, is one that it has some sort of a leadership vision for the future, rather than tries to solve a problem, because that problem doesn't exist in 35 years or 10 years. I just would be curious to hear what your response to it requires a vision of leadership.
Yeah. Well, I was just wondering, as you said that, I mean, one part of me would be very, very sympathetic, and there is no doubt about it that big projects should be part of visions. Otherwise, it's a problem, because if it's not part of a vision, it's going to create a vision of its own by default. But what I thought, and it's interesting, I actually thought that as you were speaking, what if there are other things that need to be done and that haven't been done, and I have this big vision foisted on me? So the opportunity cost issue. Well, yeah, you know, a new metro. Let's take Delhi. Just got a new metro. 40%, I don't know the exact statistics of the population living in Delhi are living below the poverty line, and they've got this spanking new metro would cost billions, unaffordable. You know, what's the call on that? I mean, I have a view. That's another issue. Well, I'll tell you what the view is. The view is, despite the ethical issues and the equity issues, I believe, as a city planner, that there are certain cities at particular stages of their development that needs critical infrastructure to guide the future. So that's my view. And the next thing to do is actually to address the poverty issue and see how the system can be made more affordable, and how it can be integrated with non-motorized and public transport. There are ways. That would be my response. I mean, but there are more radical people who would argue, and I know some of them, my friends, who would argue this is outrageous that they spend billions of dollars on a new metro system that people can't afford. So it's a call. All these are big bets. And again, it's going back to the military scenarios. I mean, when you're in the field, you actually decide, are you going to retreat, are you going to attack, you don't know. These are big bets, and what you can't afford to do, which is what we've done in Britain for so long, is not to make those big decisions. You can make a big decision not to do it. I suppose that is a decision, but you can't do nothing all the time. And so you have got to take positions. And if you're going to take positions, they need to be informed, and this is where we're coming from. And if you're going to be informed, then it needs transparent. It needs to be transparent. You need freedom for information. And these big projects now are closing up on transparency globally. It's outrageous. It is absolutely outrageous. You cannot get information about private finance in certain projects because it is not open to the public. And I predict, although I think Charles told me off once, I was ranting on or something, I predict the time is going to come when we are somewhere going to have our fingers burnt with private sector money that we didn't know where it comes from. And we're not going to have these major investments looked after in our interests. I predict that that's going to happen in one or two projects, and that consequently the issue of transparency will become very, very significant. It goes back to trust. And one last thing, this nonsense about public versus private sector workings. A successful private sector needs a successful public sector. They need each other. It's nonsense to actually think anything different. So you actually need to have a good regulation, a good regulatory framework. You need to have information, transparent information. And yes, some of it will be commercially problematic, but I think it's the only way forward. And that's a very critical issue.